Alright guys, let's see how we can use the context API inside of React in order to be able to pass data from parent to child components without the extensive prop drilling. And as stated here, context provides a way to share values between components without having explicitly to pass properties through every level of the component tree. Now let's look more in depth what this means. In practice, we would like to have one provider which will provide the same context consisting of values and function definitions to its child components. Then inside of each of those child components, we can use the context provided, and we'll be able with the use context function to grab all the functions or values which are stored inside of the provided context. Now to the implementation of the context provider. As you can see, we have 3 steps in order to create a successful context provider. Initially, we are creating the context, and for this we are creating a type for this context. So here we are storing items which are of type item. We need also to provide context defaults from the same type, and we provide here an empty array for them. Then we'll use the function createContext, where we provide those context defaults. That's basically our items context, which later we can use in our child components and inside of the provider. When we have this context, we can consume it in the child component with the function useContext. Alright, since this is the first step, here we're only initializing or declaring how our functions or data should look like. Now we'll create a provider that will define further how to manipulate the defined data, and also the second function of the provider is to give an access to the data to the child components wrapped inside of the provider. So basically those 2 components will be able to access the data from the context which the items provider gives them. So first we'll need to access the children passed to the provider or the child components. And with the structuring, we're able to grab those children and later to use them when we are displaying our provider. Then we use the function useState in order to grab what's inside of the default items or this empty array here. And also we have a setItems function which can manipulate the data. So this forms a state which is preserved and unified that our child components can access and work with. And the final step is to be able to render the context and its child components properly by providing them the needed values from the context. This means that we'll have one provider, then we'll have displayed the children, and the children should be able to access the items which are coming from our context, so from up here. And exactly this functionality here, together with the usage of state, ensures that the component 1 and 2 will be able to use the context which the items provider gives via the function useContext. So let's recap. The provider's goal is to provide certain context consisting of data and methods to its child components. Next, we'll see a practical example of this approach. So in the following example, we're having 2 different components which share the same context. With this button, the first component is adding a new item to the shared state, and the second component should be able to receive it also. And as you can see, that's how it functions in practice. And let's now see the code. In our main application component, we have one provider where we are providing our to-dos, and we have 2 components, one for generating the to-dos and displaying them, and the other one is just for displaying them. And if we see what's inside of the to-dos component, we are using the context, we are displaying each of the to-dos. Alongside, we have a new function which adds a new to-do. The difference with the access to-dos is that we have removed the function for adding to-dos and we are just using the context to-dos. Alright, Now to the context. Here again we are creating our context with the defaults on line 20, and then we're using a state to have a unified state over the to-dos. Then we have defined the add to-do function, which we trigger when we click on the button, and this just gives us a new state of to-dos with the updated information. We're generating randomly one to-do. The interesting thing is on line 42, where we're providing not only the to-dos but the function which is able to manipulate them. So this way all the components that want to use this to-do context via this to-dos provider should be compliant with this add to-do function, and they are unable to use the internal set to-dos function, which guarantees the lack of racing conditions and consistency of the data. In this project, I've used an approach where I have created separate directory for all the contexts that I have. I find it as a beneficial because I can have multiple contexts here, and then I can use those contexts to wrap components that want to use a common context. So in summary, we use React Context API where we have cases where our data is being used by multiple component instances. And it helps us to share this data in a way that it will be considered as global for the included child components. This feature allows us to have more granular sharing of chosen data between subsets of components. Also, it's worth mentioning that React Context doesn't provide complete state management because of the following features. The context is not storing any information by itself, it's just passing the data which is coming either from the component which is rendering the context provider or from the context provider itself. Once we have the data passed, the actual state management is happening via the hooks useState and useReducer. We've demonstrated a case where we used just useState. For a little bit more complex cases, React provides useReducer, and it's particularly useful when we have case where we have several states and the elements stored inside of those states are interacting with each other. Because this can cause a lot of performance and loop problems, the usage of useReducer is recommended. Alright guys, I suggest you to try the following concepts on your own, and if you liked the information in the tutorial, you can subscribe to the channel. Thank you.